Well, um, welcome to everyone that is joining at the moment. As you know, we are in this special week for us, and today we have a webinar called Beyond the Lab: the LGBTQ plus neuroscientist journey. And this webinar is held by the Gender and Sexual Diversity Working Group from ALBA, and has been organized by David Keller and Dori Grisels. So shout out to them. So we would like to start today by presenting a little bit of ALBA. This will be very short because we are excited to hear from our panelists of the day. This webinar is included in our ALBA Diversity Week that is running from Monday to Friday today. So please join us for more. If you go to alba.network/week 2023, you will discover the rest activities of the week. And what is ALBA, right? It's an international network of brain scientists committed to fostering diversity, equity, and inclusion in science and academia. Our members lead and advocate for actions and policies to counteract bias and to build inclusive research cultures. We have plenty of founding partners like FENS or IBRO, and our mission is to empower brain scientists to be effective advocates of this diversity, equity, and inclusions, to share data, recognize contributions to science and diversity, and to offer better visibility to underrepresented groups. We have more than 1,500 members in several countries. Our main activities can be divided in awareness and advocacy. By that section, we've established a declaration on equity and inclusion, data and resources, in which we create a database of scientists as a resource for speaker invitations, prize nominations, etc. Also, another activity will be related with visibility and recognition, establishing awards and highlighting success stories. And finally, networking and mentoring, creating a framework of mentoring to promote the careers of underrepresented researchers. We have an ALBA declaration that can be checked online on equity and inclusion, and it's a resource for concrete, positive, and evidence-based actions. This declaration focuses on 2 contributing factors to perpetual underrepresentation in STEM regarding implicit bias and workplace culture, and you can sign it. We have 223 organizations that have signed it, and almost 700 individual people that have signed from 52 countries. We also have database with a lot of resources, more than 1,000, that can be searched and filtered by, so you can find resources for your own organizations there. And we've organized diversity webinars that can be region specific, and you can see on the slide the different regions: Central and Eastern Europe, India, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Black in Europe, Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America, in which several topics are discussed: gender, race, mental health, disability, and so on. As we briefly mentioned before, we are proudly supported by FENS, IBRO, Society for Neuroscience, Elsevier, and so on more. And we have plenty of collaborating organizations like Black in Neuro or British Neuroscience Association, and the rest of the ones you can see on the screen. Finally, our group is the Gender and Sexual Diversity Working Group. The co-chairs at the moment are Jordan Morocco and Dori Grisels, and the rest of the people that you can see on the screen, we work and participate in this group, and you can join. You can join us if you have anything you would like to help with or express your ideas regarding these topics. We already held a webinar in 2021 at FENS that we titled Navigating Academia as an LGBTQIA plus neuroscientist. And you can watch this webinar if you're interested on demand on Alba's YouTube channel. We also have a podcast that already has 12 episodes and counts with 1,000 downloads and has reached 50 countries. It's quite interesting and is available in many of the platforms such as Spotify. And in 2023, we are launching guidelines for designing inclusive forums for gender and sexual diversity. And today, we are going to have a fantastic webinar that I will be leading. I'm Maria Bancheri from the University of Edinburgh, United Kingdom. I will be the moderator. And we have today Soraya, Camila, B2, and Troy that I will introduce a bit more soon. And that's it. When you finish this webinar, please help us by filling the survey. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen just now, and I will go ahead and tell us a bit more about the goal of the webinar. We want today to discuss the challenges faced by LGBTQ plus neuroscientists with a focus on topics such as career development, inclusion policies, and advancements in representation and visibility within the scientific community. Our aim is to provide a platform for insights for speakers at different career stages, as you will see when I finally introduce our panelists. And to promote a more inclusive and supportive environment for LGBTQ plus individuals in neuroscience. So without further ado, I will start in a random order by Soraya. She's a postdoctoral researcher at UCLA Neurosurgery. She works in memory, and she's been one of the first members in the UCL Faculty of Brain Sciences LGBTQ plus Equity Committee. She's also co-founded a cross-departmental newsletter which regularly features LGBTQ plus events and highlighted the experiences of scientists within the queer community. You want to say hello, Soraya?
Hi, everyone. Excited to talk about these things today with you all.
Great to have you. In this order that I made up, now we have Dr. Camila Nord, and they are an assistant professor of cognitive neuroscience at the University of Cambridge. Camila is the group leader of the Mental Health Neuroscience Lab at the MRC. She's always interested in communicating science and has spoken in many important places like BBC, Sky News, and she just has published her first book, The Balanced Brain, The Science of Mental Health, that you can find in the editorial Penguin in 2023. So welcome, Camila. Would you like to say hello?
Yeah, thanks so much, Maria. Great to be here.
Okay, thank you. And then we have Dr. Bitu Kaharaman, and they are an associate professor of biology and psychology at Ashoka University in New Delhi. He is an associate professor of biology and psychology at Ashoka University, and they have been involved in various social justice movements, including co-founding the Telangana Ihira Intersex Trans Samiti and the Trans Academia Collective. Welcome to the webinar. Bitu, would you like to say something? Bitu, maybe having any connection problems? Okay, they can say hello later. So I will pass to introduce the
hello, can you all hear me?
Oh yeah, hello.
Yes.
Welcome, B2. Fantastic. And then we have Dr. Troy Repke, and they are an associate professor and associate dean at animal science at Rutgers University in New Jersey. They study gonadal steroids, and they have been openly queer for over 30 years and advocate for the LGBT community in STEM with several scientific societies, social media spaces, and so on. They also serve as associate dean of diversity, equity, and inclusion for the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences, focusing their efforts on faculty diversity, retention, and development, and integrating and supporting student initiatives on campus. Hello, Troy. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for inviting me to participate.
That's great. So now we are going to move to a series of questions that we've prepared for our panelists. They will be divided in career, inclusion policies, and advances in representation and visibility. Our aim is that our panelists will be sharing with us their experiences and answering the questions. I will probably direct these questions to one of them, but please, the rest of you, feel free to chip in whenever you think you may contribute to the conversation at that point. So, unless we have any questions, I will start with the first of these questions. Okay, there we go. So let's start with the career section. So could you share your personal journey as an LGBTQ+ neuroscientist, and what challenges have you faced in your career and how did you overcome them? And I would like B2, for example, to start with this question. Okay, let's start with someone else until B2 can settle. No?
Came into place with good signal, so if you can just repeat the question, I should be able to pass it.
Okay, no problem at all. Can you please share your personal journey as an LGBTQ+ neuroscientist, and what challenges have you faced in your career and how did you overcome them?
Okay, well, I think as some other people have sometimes said, and so I have to speak largely from the perspective of being a trans scientist. And also, honestly, I'm also a politically active scientist. So as in around not just transness, but other aspects of class and in the context of India, caste, gender, right? Disability. And so it becomes hard to disentangle experiences that I may have gone through of marginalization and to understand where those come from, right? So I will just say this, that some of these experiences include the idea of putting forward propositions that will make places, for example, trans inclusive or queer inclusive, that just meet a resounding kind of silence, right? And so things don't move often. People are hesitant to collaborate with queer and trans people. They're not sure, right, what's going on. If somebody approaches them and is a cis man, they think, okay, this guy must will be fully functioning and will be a collaborator who can fully pull their own weight. And people are much more hesitant with someone who's trans. They imagine that there's all kinds of other stuff lurking in the background. They don't know what. And often people's desire to be politically correct can lead to them not wanting to engage. They think, I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to be judged. I just don't want to engage too much with this person. I'll keep my distance. I'll be polite, So some of those attitudes. And I largely found that the best way to engage is to be very upfront, to talk about these things often, and to really communicate to people that what I expect from them behaviorally. And that helps, I think. That helps a lot of people, because they're often very uncertain of how they should be handling someone like me. And then, of course, there's some of the stuff that comes with being transmasculine and looking, as I still kind of do, like I'm 17. So often, for example, people assume that I'm very early in my career, but I don't look 40, right? So some of that, that stuff also influences the ways in which people can react to one. And also it's a question of which students feel like they can take a risk by joining a lab led by a trans person, right? And so often you're getting students who are willing to take a risk, which is great because then they do interesting science, but you're not getting the same distribution of people in your lab as other labs. You're not getting the same distribution of collaborations. You're not getting the same, and of course you have to pick your battles as a trans person. So you're not necessarily fighting on an equal field when it comes to various other, requirements around resources and so on and so forth. And I don't know about other trans people, but just mentoring other trans kids takes up a lot of time. And so I also spend less time on science than most, scientists who have privileges and who don't. I know that there are several fantastic scientists with privilege who share their privilege and spend their time creating safe spaces for people without those privileges. But from compared to people who aren't engaged in that kind of activity, certainly we're suffering from a productivity disadvantage. Yeah.
Really, really interesting take, B2. some of you would like to chip in? If not, I will move to the next question. Okay, Troy?
Sure. So, as you stated, I've been out for over three decades. Came out my first year of grad school in 1992. But I was a marine biologist until 2005. And I became a neuroscientist because when I was looking for a postdoc after finishing my PhD in the States, I was not willing to move to a state where my same-sex relationship would not be legally protected. And at that time, there were only a few states on the West Coast and the Northeast. And I couldn't find a postdoc in my field in a state that protected my relationship. And so I ended up switching to neuroscience after talking to a couple colleagues of my PI who was like, well, you're interested in estrogen signaling. You should go work with this scientist at Oregon Health and Science University who was one of the first people to show rapid estrogen signaling. And, and I had to struggle with that because I was like, I don't want to study the brain. I'm interested in marine invertebrates. They don't have brains. But I got desperate and I ended up doing neuroscience. And now, almost 20 years later, here I am. So the challenge for me was literally I had to change what my career was because of the socio-political situation here in the US. Now it's less of an issue in the sense that marriage equality for now is still safe, but you still have to deal with regional differences in laws that protect queer and trans people, et cetera. And as somebody who identifies as genderqueer as well for 30 years, it's like I'm also concerned about that. So for me, the biggest challenge was actually switching into neuroscience. Like I had to learn what a neuron was because literally we're studying sea urchins, right? Like, so I had to make a big challenge, and that was just learning neuroscience when I became a neuroscientist.
Really interesting. That's a big change, a career change, of course. Okay, I'm gonna move on to the next question. What advice do you have for LGBTQ plus individuals pursuing careers in neuroscience or academia? And let's go back to you, Troy, for this question.
So I think my advice for people, and this is the advice for everybody, but regardless of your identity, but for queer people, queer students in particular, it's very important to have a good supportive mentor. You're not going to be successful if you're in a lab where somebody is not fully engaged with who you are and wants to support you. I, as a PI, made it a point to make sure that my lab was a safe space for all queer students and any other marginalized group, but specifically queer students. And so most of my lab are part of the community, and I'm here to make sure that they have a good experience in STEM and can be successful moving on. So I feel like it's very important to choose the right mentor who is supportive of you as who you are.
That's great. Camila, would you like to add something?
Yeah, so my experience as a gay neuroscientist, so I've been out for about 15 years, so I've never really been in as a scientist, is that it has vacillated in ease depending on how many queer colleagues I have. So at the moment, where I am a group leader, there are 15 group leaders, and 3 of us are openly gay and have same-sex partners. And that I've never worked anywhere else like that. And I think it makes it the norm rather than the exception. So when you hire a new staff member, people actually initially question what gender their partner might be, because there are so many people with same-sex partners. So I have found that when you happen to find an environment where you're in a bigger minority than usual, it makes a real difference.
Great. Do you, B2 or Soraya, want to add something to any advice for the individuals pursuing a career just now? Okay, so
Yeah, I definitely want to echo the what Troy and Camilla have said, that having a mentor one and having a community too are just hugely important. Make everything so much easier. And one piece of advice that my mentor gave me, which is maybe a little counter to the tune of anyway, would be precious with your time. The ultimate goal of EDI success is to retain people like us. And if, you're spending, or maybe people are better at time management than me, but there have definitely been points, and I'm very early on in my career, and there have been points when the EDI work has maybe taken more space than would have been good for my career. And yeah, it's easy, you stick your neck out a little bit, and universities are so hungry for people to be doing this work. And, the people who tend to be doing this work are from those underrepresented communities, and it can just, it can snowball. And, obviously we're passionate about it, and we want to progress these things. But at the end of the day, we don't work in EDI, we work in science. And, that needs to be a focus.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that, actually. And it also relates to one of the Q&As that I see has come in about whether our academic load is greater than others. And I think there are kind of two problems that can happen. One is, if you manage to stay in academia, you probably are asked to be on many more committees, and you're mentoring lots of people. And so you're spending lots of time, which is part of it, which has absolutely been my experience. But then a second part that I've really kind of worried about, because I've seen happen to some of my colleagues or friends, is that it becomes so much of your work that actually it takes away from time that you have for research, and it can jeopardize your research career. So I think I've always kept that in the back of my head as I commit to things, that I would like my research identity to be quite distinct from this.
Thank you, Camila, for your answer, and also for taking the question from the people attending the webinar. We will have time at the end as well. Feel free to take them whenever, but we will also have time as well at the end to answer whatever questions we have from the public. So please, whoever wants to ask something or comment something, feel free to do so, because we will be happy to maintain that conversation. And now, following up with Camila, if that's okay, have you noticed any specific biases or barriers that LGBTQ plus neuroscientists encounter in their career progression? I know we already touched a bit upon this. And how do you think, in your opinion, this can be addressed?
It's interesting, because I think there are all kinds of biases that play into like little judgments that people make, who to speak to at conferences, whose papers to give slightly better reviews than others. And there's lots of robust data on that, for example, having a female first author is worse than having a male first author, female first and last, worst of all, and so on. And I imagine these things kind of play out in different ways with LGBT individuals, if they're kind of openly LGBT. And I also, just to bring a kind of positive note, I've actually personally noticed some advantages of being LGBT in terms of career progression and biases. And the advantage that I've most noticed is about being a parent. So many of my female colleagues who give birth and are kind of subject to the patriarchal norms of having a family end up sacrificing much more of their career than my fellow gay colleagues, who, if they have a family, they split things 50-50 as we do, and it ends up not affecting one of you disproportionately because there are no kind of assumptions about who that would be.
That's great. I think it's even research on that, like the salaries within how the salaries drop in case of female presenting people and people in gay marriages or heterosexual marriages. Very interesting. Is some of you wanting to add something to this question before we move on? Maybe Troy?
Sure. So I think there are barriers, and I'm working, and I know I work a group of people who are trying to remove barriers for we're trying to affect change in our field of neuroendocrinology and how we talk about sex and gender, and the biases that are in place about sex and gender and transness. And so to me, that is a big challenge, especially in neuroendocrinology, where you're talking about hormones in the brain. And there's a lot of resistance because some of the people who are senior have been part of the group of people who have pathologize transness in their work. And so I feel like that, to me, is the biggest bias, is making sure that our science is benefiting the community and not pathologizing the community. And so, yeah, I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, thank you. My next question was for Soraya, but I don't see them in the call just now.
Yeah, she dropped off. I'm not sure.
Okay, then if B2 wanted to reply to this one, what is something an ally or colleague has done for you that has positively impacted your career? Yeah, B2, if you would like to respond to this, yeah.
Sorry, so your question, so I turned off my video because the sound was a little, yeah. Can you just repeat the question?
Yeah, no problem. What is something that an ally or a colleague has done for you that has positively impacted your career?
I'll talk for now about positive stuff, right, that allies have done. Stories of hope. I'm currently functioning in this university because, and of course also in my day-to-day life, because of the role of allies. And, when I came into the university, allies from the university set it up so that I could immediately and instantly function with my chosen name and chosen email ID, right? And that I think helped hugely. I've had, I think just the fact also that very quickly my colleagues and the students, workers, everybody in the university very quickly took to and to really educating each other so that I didn't have to educate each individual I met about, my pronouns and how to refer to me. That, I mean, that's just hugely eased my existence here, right? And it doesn't happen as a matter of course in every place that I have worked. So, allies mean everything. I mean, sometimes I think, I don't know if those of you who are allies, and of course all of us are allies in various ways, I think that allyship is powerful and it makes the world a much, much better place. So if you're an ally, please, it's, everything that you do is appreciated. It's really, really, really helpful. And, I think I just know a couple of us trans scientists in the country. Of course, we have an unprecedented situation of trans visibility in India and in the South Asian subcontinent because of the historic visibility of trans women. And I think, at some point there's a whole other thing to be said about how we have never had to encounter or even deal with various questions that plague other areas such as turf discourse and so on and so forth, because just the visibility and the historical visibility of trans women, but also the struggles that they face being very visible, means that just questions about and so really it's a very large number of cis feminists who simply, of course, pushed by this visibility and the struggle of trans women, simply would not even imagine that trans women aren't natural or that they aren't here. Simply wouldn't imagine that trans women aren't struggling more than cis women. I mean, that's something that you have to struggle to convey very often in other social contexts. And the fact that cis feminists have learned here from their grassroots observation of historically visible trans women has completely changed the landscape. We don't have to navigate turfness in the same way here as one does in other spaces. So there's a whole bunch of ways in which allyship has really changed how we function.
Let's all allies take notes of that. Thank you, B2. So, Soraya, would you like to chip in for this question? The question was, what is something that ally or colleague has done for you that has positively impacted your career?
So I think for me, advocacy, and I know that's just sort of more general, it's not, specific to queer identities or anything, but, having someone in your corner who is really, actively working for you to progress is, unspeakably valuable. And I'm very, very lucky to have been in that position, in my career. I think it's probably the only reason I've got a job now, if I'm honest. And it makes such a big difference when it's, your supervisor or someone further on in their career. But I think this is something we can do for each other as well, right? You can find your community, and then you can also try and uplift your community. And it's about, just thinking to introduce people to other people, or you see an interesting project that someone might have some insight on, and you can try and link these people together. I also had one friend who just kept nominating me for prizes, which was really lovely. And that's just the kind of thing you can do, right? That just gives that extra push forward that I think can be really valuable.
Yeah, definitely. You can also nominate yourself to prizes. Not like any of us has done that before, but yeah. Anyway, before we move from the section of career to the inclusion policies, I would like to take some of the questions that we have in the chat already, if you're okay with that. So Karen Davis has asked, do you find that your academic load is much greater than others, given that so many communities now strive for greater diversity, which is good, of course, but that actually puts the onus on a small group of people to be included or involved? I even heard just cisgender female saying, I'm the female token of this committee, so I can imagine what your answer will be. So any of you that wants to add to this, please do.
The answer is yes. I'm literally now the associate dean for DEI because I started doing all this work without being the associate dean of DEI on my campus. And so then they're like, oh, well, then you're going to do the diversity action plan, and then you're going to become the dean. Like, it was just sort of the natural progression of all the work that I was already doing. So at least now I have a title and some power and some influence, as opposed to just doing the work in silence. I was on a lot of committees. I was also informal mentoring of pretty much every queer grad student on campus. It was a lot. So, and even some off campus at other universities would contact me. So I feel like that's a burden that a lot of faculty who are from any sort of marginalized group, it's not just special to LGBTQ plus scientists.
Yeah, completely. Some of you would like to add something else to this question?
Yeah, sure. Exactly the same experience. Yeah. So, I was doing various kinds of D&I mentorship and so on, without, an official position for a very long time. So certainly it increases one's load. Honestly, when one's also mentoring students who are queer and trans, that involves a lot of time that they often also require off to deal with various aspects of identity, marginalization, humiliation, medical care, and so on and so forth. And so it also means sometimes that one's collective productivity in a lab also is impacted. And they're also taking on a disproportionate load of educating their, fellow students about themselves, navigating, various things socially and so on. I should also note that I was asked to explain what TERF means. So the word TERF refers to what's called a trans-exclusionary radical feminist, although people have sometimes, renamed these, as feminism appropriating, right, transphobes, because, one can argue that there's nothing transphobic that needs to be a component of radical feminism. I would consider myself also very much a feminist, and in some ways a radical feminist. So, but again, the point really is that the idea that feminism would include any aspect of trans exclusion is, saying that this is often an aspect of white supremacy sounds like some abstract social sciencey thing that one's saying. But for us, it's very real, right? I mean, in the context of a colonial kind of suppression of that trans visibility, we now have to deal with all kinds of colonial legislation that is transphobic, a lack of civil rights, and so on. And of course, not everything about transphobia in the South Asian context comes from colonialism, but a lot emerges from aspects of feudal structure as well. But it's important to realize that thinking of so when I mentioned allyship, thinking of feminism or the concerns that cis women may have in science as being opposed to in any way the rights of trans persons really emerges from the particular, white supremacist sort of cultural framework. And as somebody who doesn't have to deal with that because of the way that trans visibility and allyship work here, I always like to offer it as an alternative to consider, so that one doesn't think that there is some sort of contradiction or necessary contradiction between, for lack of a better word, cis feminism and trans-inclusive feminism that one often sees play out in different areas. And I think that's something that a lot of trans women have to really battle within academic contexts. Yeah.
Yes, it's very important that we highlight intersectionality, right? Probably. So next question will be from Alex Dungeon. I'm so sorry. Do you put anything on your slides or posters at conferences to out yourselves? Troy does. Okay, what about you two?
Oh yeah, I mean,
Yes.
but as often we say as trans people, we have no choice but to be out. So as soon as I'm saying he, they, and speaking with a voice that is not fully lowered and testosterone, I'm outing myself. And of course, I'm very happy to out myself. It's so easy to not have to question how differently people might behave if you weren't out to them. It just, dissolves that question, sets up my filters, and then I only have to deal with relatively nice people. So.
Okay, what about Soraya and Camila? Do you put anything on your presentations or posters?
No, but also possibly because I've never thought of it before. I guess I have the privilege of, gender conforming, this, so it's never, I guess I'm out because I'm out, and I've never thought about putting it on a poster. I've got, little rainbows around my desk and stuff, but it's a good idea. Yeah, I'd never thought of it.
I don't, but I mean, if you Google me, it's really obvious. I opened my book with a discussion of my gay wedding, so it's not.
Okay, more reasons to read that new book, Camila. So last question before we move to the inclusion policies section of this webinar is also from Karen Davis. I am fortunate to live and work in Canada, but know how difficult it can be in other countries where laws or acceptance are very, very hard. How have you navigated your career choices about where to live and work, and how do you advise others regarding such geographic decisions? And maybe some of you like to add to this question. If you change your idea on where to conduct your research regarding what were the LGBTQ policies in the place.
Yeah, I already said that I had to literally change my field of study because of that. And it's even impacted when I was looking for faculty jobs in 2008, 2009. Still at that time, marriage equality was not the law of the land, and I had to limit my searches to states that had some sort of recognition. And so it limited to the Northeast and the West Coast again. So yeah, I mean, it totally limits where I want to do my science, where I want to live. And even now it's gone back to where it's even worse in some states. So I know I have colleagues in Texas and Florida and other places in the Midwest and the South that are seriously considering leaving because it's so hostile for the queer community right now and this type of work that we're trying to do. So it's hard.
My wife and I have had this discussion as well, actually, just with respect to the United States in general. We think it might be a bit risky to move there because there have recently been cases where one parent has been taken off the birth certificate of a child because they were same-sex parents, and obviously that's the case in Italy as well at the moment. So,
yeah, as someone who's just moved to the States with her wife, it was always it's the best move for my career, but it was always a temporary thing, because I think the last couple of years have shown how easily things can slip back, right? Which is a terrifying prospect. Not that I completely trust the UK government on many things either. So
Yeah, I'd like to add because, again, a lot of young people in India, for example, think that they should go to, say, the US or Europe in order to have access to places where legislations cover rights, marriage, queer marriages. And right now, in fact, we just had a Supreme Court judgment saying that that's not going to be something implemented here. That said, I've lived in just the US and India. And as a trans person, I found India much easier to navigate than the US, where again, as I said, the transphobia that is sort of culturally prevalent is so high that I felt unsafe on the streets, right, as a visibly trans person, in a way that I don't in this context, right? In the sense, nobody's going to get upset that I am on the streets and visible, right? I felt like in the US, there's a certain category of men who are just upset that they have seen a trans person in the streets. And so I do think it's important to two things. One, to distinguish between day-to-day life in terms of how it flows legislatively and not just culturally, but in general, what is day-to-day life like? Two, if I were ever in a position where my rights to do all of these things were questioned, as is the case with respect to at least queer relationships in India, I feel on secure ground fighting here, given the ways in which discourse around immigration works, right? Anytime I had any opinion about American society, right? Whether it was said or not, the question really was like, who are you? Like, you have immigrated here because we are so great. So, just be grateful. And I did not enjoy the way that was conveyed. And certainly here in this context, I feel like I want to be here. I want to fight it out. Somebody needs to fight it out. And I would rather be here saying, look, I'm born here. This is our context. This is our situation. This is what is going to change. And I have that right in some sense in this context that I don't, in any country where I immigrate. And so, of course, a lot of this deals with how immigration works, and specifically also how immigration works when one is a person of color. And also specific kinds of racist ideas about how, like, the ideal model minority Indian or South Asian or East Asian lab member or PI should be, right? That there's very strong incentives for us to function as quiet, non-disruptive individuals, right? And we're too disruptive to, if one is asking questions or if one is vocal about these things, then it's just it's too much of a stereotype disruptor to be tolerated. And there's a very strong sort of incentive for one to behave in stereotype conforming ways, I will say. So all of these factors, I am happier functioning here in the Indian context than I was in the US as a trans person of color. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, all of you. So let's move to the inclusion policies section of this webinar. And the first question will be for Ritu. What are some examples of effective inclusion policies and practices that have been implemented in academic and scientific institutions to support LGBTQ+ individuals?
Right. So, as I said, functioning as a trans person often involves many of these measures to be in place or to be put in place very rapidly once we're in these institutions. And some of them just deal with us getting in the door. So if you have an application where you have publications with different names, different first names and last names in some cases, you're dealing with some people who so you don't know who will vouch for you when you're as a former colleague. You don't feel as entitled to ask for contacts in a new place when you're queer or trans, and so some of those factors really just influence whether is an application for a job by a trans person considered, or of course, it's also like in India, things are very bureaucratic. We sort of inherited the British bureaucracy when it comes to processing inputs. And so often it's just sort of, this is a fraudulent application. There's one certificate with one name, there's another certificate with another name. And often it's just, you're just out the door unless somebody knows you enough and you can activate a contact and say, look, I've applied. It's me, right? That's not a fraudulent application. And so at this stage, the degree of career safety, I feel, is only from people possibly just recognizing me as a person and recognizing that, I'm not making a fraudulent application with a bunch of shifty sort of looking, publications and experiences and certificates from a variety of different places. And as I said, the bureaucracy means that often we're not just being judged on recent publications, but also, you have to submit your 10th grade certificate when you're applying to a job in India. Some of these things have to line up before you're considered to be non-fraudulent. So some of it's just, are you conceiving of trans people as possible applicants to your job? Are you just making it so that a trans applicant is not automatically going to be considered, a fraudulent application? Two, once the trans person is in, do you have easy to implement measures for them to operate with their chosen gender, chosen name? You have something in place, or at least are you willing to set up something? And then there's the question of, so there's questions of how institutions put in sensitization policies. There's the question of how, if somebody is transitioning while they're in an institution, how the institution supports them. There's a question of how, if you have to get all your certificates lined up, are past institutions going to give you a revised certificate with your preferred name? And so all of these are institutional measures. So really, for trans people to function, just from even getting their foot in the door, we need a bunch of institutional measures in place. We can't just sort of be like, well, it's just, covert discrimination. It's also just like some structural measures and institutional measures that need to be put in place for us to even sort of enter institutions.
Really, really important from the point of view of the policies, of course. So for Camila now, will you be happy to answer what is something that an institution has done that has made you feel more welcome as an LGBTQ+ individual?
Well, when I moved institutions a few years ago, I did encounter a kind of radical shift in culture when it comes to LGBT inclusion. And that made me think it's not really like I'd noticed its absence. I just sort of thought, I was the only gay person in my department. That was how it was. I didn't really think much about it. I wasn't involved in kind of changing it either. So I don't want to attribute blame to my colleagues. It could have been me. But then I got to a department where from the very first day, the kind of active inclusion agenda was obvious. There are kind of rainbow flags everywhere. We have sort of LGBT and STEM cake day, and there's just kind of constant barrage of LGBT stuff. At the moment, at the university level, we're doing a kind of survey of every single LGBT staff member in all kind of staff categories to see whether they've ever encountered any barriers and what could be done to counteract them. I encountered, my sort of mentors at the time, they'd mentored other gay people before. So it was really just kind of, it felt very different than in the past. I have no idea why this is. I don't actually want to give Cambridge much credit here because I've heard other departments have it very, very different, thus the big survey. But my particular institute, which is a kind of small and extremely friendly institute, has this really, really inclusive atmosphere. And I think it's commendable. And a lot of that has just come from basically putting effort into promoting. Every year there's a photo taken of all the LGBT scientists at the unit that then gets tweeted. I mean, it really was just so clear that they were supportive that I never had any doubts.
That sounds very welcoming indeed. Soraya, would you like to add something to this question?
Yeah, so when I started my PhD, UCL was the first university to join Stonewall's Global Diversity Champion scheme. And, it felt like a big deal, right? Athena Swan is very prominent in the kind of university EDI landscape. And so to have something focused on LGBTQ plus, policies and stuff felt really important. And I know this is maybe supposed to be a kind of more positive take on stuff, but actually UCL personally has been incredibly disappointing in the last couple of years. It's also the first university to leave Stonewall's program, and the anti-trans movement at UCL is incredibly strong, and actually why I ended up kind of formalizing my interest in EDI. I got, the rough end of some intimidation tactics from a very senior, very successful academic who took a freedom of information request out on our emails. And it was myself as an early career researcher and some other, queer PhD students. And it was kind of terrifying, to be honest. But then that's when I really realized those are the voices that are active at UCL and active in UCL EDI. And so that's what really pushed me to take a step to formalize it, and try and, be part of those conversations. And so I think whatever UCL did to make me feel welcome, they quite quickly, well, not quickly, I guess I was there for quite a long time, but there's definitely been undone at the moment. I think, especially in the UK, the transphobic movement is really something to be reckoned with.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that with us. I think despite the questions about what positive things the institution has done for you, it's very important that we bring up the things that can be improved, definitely. So yeah, really important that things like the webinar we are holding today need to be done to open the conversation, right? So now for Troy, please, have you seen improvement in diversity and inclusion in your field in recent years? And if so, what factors contributed to these changes?
I think my field is definitely moving in the right direction. There is resistance, especially in terms of trans and gender diverse people. And that's good to see. There's certainly more people of the younger generation and my generation of academics who are on board with building a trans inclusive science. And that's great to see. The changes were due in large part to, well, I was like the only genderqueer person in this one society until just recently, right? I was the only transgender queer person anymore. Like, and I still, I don't identify as trans, but just as gender. And so it was very isolating. And, but now there are more younger generations who identify, postdocs, grad students. And so I'm able to help them and push for change. And so, last year we had a big trans healthcare symposium at our Society of Behavioral Neuroendocrinology that really pushed things forward, that I was able to help happen and behind the scenes. And so that we're really dealing with this very important issue in the field. And it's due to people like myself and my colleagues who have been vocal for the past 5-6 years of pushing it forward. So it's really people being loud, and then also making sure that we give space for people who are trans and gender diverse to have their voices magnified and listened to is really important. It can't all just be cis people being our allies. We need to include the people who are actually part of that community in this process.
Yeah, definitely. Tamira, would you like to add something to this question regarding the improvement in your field regarding diversity and inclusion?
Sure, yeah. So I think actually the biggest improvement I've seen since, maybe 2008, 2009, when I first started being out in an academic environment, is just the kind of level at which it's normalized. So I think when I was an undergraduate, I was quite comfortable being out to undergraduates, but I was kind of, there certainly was nothing above that level. And then as a PhD student, it sort of was a kind of just part of my identity, but it certainly wasn't spoken about to the degree that it is today. I went to an event last week that was a dinner that my college was hosting, and it was open to undergraduates who identified as LGBTQ plus, and it was sort of like allies could come, but sort of give space for LGBTQ plus people. So that was almost everyone in the room. And anyway, the room was full. It was like 100 people. And that would never, never, never have happened in 2009, let alone, before that. It would have been a really small room.
When I was in grad school, it would have been just me, because every marine lab I was at, I was literally the only one out of 200 people. So yeah, times have changed.
Well, we see some improvement then. So the last question of this section, I would like Soraya to answer. So how can we ensure that inclusion policies are not just on paper, but they are actively practiced and enforced within the academic and scientific institutions, Soraya?
Yeah, I think we've maybe already touched on some of the aspects as to why as to my answer for this question, which is that the kind of workload for this is falling on, marginalized groups. And I think hiring actual people whose job it is to do EDI in EDI spaces is going to make a huge difference. Not to say, that, having academics involved and having academics lead these projects is still very important. But, I've seen some really successful institutes at places I've worked who have, managed to get funding for someone to be pushing and, their focus being the EDI work. And it makes such a big difference, to how organized it is, to how easy it is to get, more people involved when it's not just, oh, there's Soraya again, she talks about EDI stuff. And especially being, a younger researcher or trying to do this as a PhD student, sometimes it feels like, your voice doesn't carry much weight, right? You haven't made it yet. And so people don't necessarily have to listen to you. And I think there's something to be said for, everyone has a sphere of influence, right? And you can impact your workplace culture at whatever level you're at, and you should try to. But yeah, I think having people whose job it actually is to push this forward and having that integrated instead of, I don't know the situation at most universities because most of my career I've been at UCL, but there's kind of central EDI, which feels like a completely separate entity to anything that we do. And I can see now that it's starting to try and, unify and make things consistent across departments. But it's hard because academia's, everyone's kind of the king of their own little castle, right? But yeah, hiring people to do this work and not just kind of, letting it fall on marginalized groups, I think is key to moving things forward.
Thank you, Soraya. So if you guys are okay with it, let's do the same as we did in the previous section, and let's move to some of the attendees' questions before we move on. So from Jose Pena, he's asking, given the LGBTQ community is a natural minority and frequently not as visually evident as being female or male, do you think that LGBTQ condition must be personally private, or would be held by general people mentioning LGBTQ plus rather than LGBTQ individuals having to personally come out of the closet themselves? Feel free to chip in.
I would say yes, absolutely. Jose is absolutely right. It's really important for everybody to create a framework. For example, pronouns are useful, but I will say that for closeted trans persons, sometimes pronouns put some pressure on them because it's particularly painful to not come out as, with your pronouns of choice. So I want to say that that's not the only thing that people should do. I think it's useful when there is, I think it's useful for people to declare their own pronouns if they're comfortable with that. But I'm just saying that I see a lot of allies thinking that that's the only thing that they should do. And I want to say that make sure you do it in a way that doesn't put pressure on people who you assume are allies, right? So allies, I think it's important to sort of do things that you are comfortable and that you want to do. But if, and it's good to perhaps advocate, but not necessarily pressure people who you may not think of as, say, trans, but who may be closeted transphobe. So that's one thing. And two, yes, I think it's important for them. I think having sort of a little nod, a flag, or a movement symbol, whether when it comes to wanting to foster and create a space in neuroscience, and especially in neuroscience, given that we're looking at behavior, right? I think it's just especially important for us to signal when our labs are safe spaces around not just queer individuals, but also individuals of color. And I think especially around disability, I think neuroscience and behavior have a particularly problematic history of dealing with these questions. And I think we all have to indicate when we are a space that will allow people who experience a disability to work on it in ways where they're not being told by people who don't share that disability. Even academic stuff that sort of talks over their personal experience. And I think creating that space is, at least for me, I found it to be one of the most challenging things to do in building a lab. Because when you're building a lab, you very soon realize that, and perhaps this has to do with also the wider framework of neurodiversity and understanding, often the particular problems that students encounter when they're doing PhDs and when they're, navigating the world of science have to do with the specific ways in which their brain interacts with information. And some of these are very specific, and thinking of ways to make the material not just more accessible, but also to have a group where people are not triggering each other just by virtue of who they are. Somebody who is out is sometimes a trigger for somebody who is not out. Somebody who is not out is sometimes the loudest transphobe or queerphobe in the room. These are navigating all of these with sensitivity is not a simple thing. And so it does call upon, of course, everybody, but also allies to really keep educating themselves. And I think indicating that one's lab is open to this and also following through with not shutting down kinds of criticism or suggestions about how lab culture should be. I think that's an important thing to do. And it's, I think, far from a settled question as to how we create more inclusive lab spaces. And some of it is also, I remember feeling excluded from groups of scientists who really thought they were they thought they were not racist. They thought they were not sexist, right? But often it varied from sort of just lab conversations being very, very culturally specific, sports specific, sports specific, cultural stuff, specific things people had all watched. Some of these things are harmless, but they can exclude. So really thinking about this is I think not simple. It's a sort of unsatisfactory response, but yes, allies need to, it's not just people who are queer who should, create as much sort of visibility as possible, but also allies. And I think it does help for people to sort of, it does help for people to be out. But at the same time, I find that people who are not out are dealing with specific pressures. And it's just, I used to think everyone should be out. I have always been out. I have never been in the closet, right? So I find it helps me, but I do realize that it doesn't help everybody. It's not useful for everybody. I know several people who are just, very, very attached to, say, their parents, and they can't have this discussion with their family. I don't want them to go through, what many of us went through, right? Those horrible conversations. And I don't know if I can ask somebody else to even do that. So I do provide my own example as an out person and how it eases my cognitive load. I don't have to think about whether to be out. That helps me, right? It's one tick mark. I don't have to revisit that question. So I can talk about how it helps me, but I still find it difficult to ask or to suggest even to anybody else that they be out. I can tell them this is how it's helped me, and it's your decision. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to raise, that it's also not necessarily safe for everyone to be out. And I think there can be pressure to be out. Not being out, might invalidate someone's queer, and of course it doesn't, right? Like it doesn't at all. And I'm speaking from some personal experience here. So I'm half Iranian, and I have a lot of family in Iran, and they don't know that I'm queer. They don't know that I have a wife. The general rule is if you move to the UK, that's when you find out. And it's not even for me, it's for my mum. She's so close with her family, and she talks to them literally every day. And I just couldn't bear the thought of jeopardizing that in any way, because I feel like if she had to choose, she would choose me, but I don't want to make her have to choose that, right? And so I think it's an important point that obviously being visible and being out and being queer is important, but it's important to know that sometimes that's maybe not the right option for everyone.
I think that's really important point, that not everybody needs to be out. There are major issues with safety and security, especially if you're financially dependent on parents and stuff. As somebody who experienced homelessness due to this, it's something that I always tell students or young people, like, don't come out if you're not safe enough to do so. I've actually had to house a trans student who came out to his parents and got kicked out temporarily, and he spent a weekend in my house until he found some place to live. And eventually they repaired the relationship. But it's a dangerous situation here in the States and everywhere else, and you need to be careful about coming out. And it should be our allies who are building a safe space for us to do that. That there is security built in. That if there is an issue with family, there's somebody to fall back on. There's a community.
Yeah, I typically have between 1 and 4 to 5 trans kids living with me at any moment of time, and everybody who's dealing with stuff at home is also dealing with a lot of emotional upheaval while they're staying over. So yes, there is all of that, and it's what one has to do if one is trying to be there for young trans kids.
Well, really interesting conversation, ignited after Jose's question, as usual, whenever we discuss with Jose. So now we have an anonymous question that has asked, do you think the queer identity should qualify for diversity funding mechanisms? For example, in the US, it generally doesn't count for NIH awards. As a gay, white, cis male, I'm not very wary of taking up a space meant for others, but I'm not sure if I just have a hard time accepting that I face enough adversity to be worth supporting with these special funds.
So this is an issue that is kind of near and dear, because I know other people, including myself, have been advocating for changes at NIH and NSF. John Freeman, especially, who has been working hard at that. And so in the States, since they mentioned NIH, depending upon the institute, a diversity supplement can include sexual orientation, gender identity, if there is another system of marginalization for a white person, such as being from a rural zip code, being neurodiverse, et cetera, right? So it can't just be sexuality and gender identity, which is what some of us are advocating for, especially for trans identities and gender diverse identities here in the States, as they're experiencing major marginalization right now. So, and historically. So I understand that person's comment and concerns about like taking up space, but if you've experienced marginalization, and any queer identity is experiencing that here in the States. So I feel like it should be included, and it depends, and it can be depending upon the institute and the specific mechanism. Speaking of about in the US, I don't know about the rest of the world, of course. So.
I will maybe just add something about some of these forms of funding. Of course, most funding bodies are national, and there are international funds sometimes for some kinds of research, right? They're few and far between, right? International grants. And I find that almost all diversity measures are only, even if they're international awards, are largely implemented with respect to for lack of a better word, colonial states, or what's called an advanced capitalist country. And in many ways, they're premised on the logic that if you, if you want to function as part of a global minority, that you should immigrate to a nation state where you count as a minority in that particular context, right? And so I find that to be a vestige of a largely colonial framework hanging out over how science is done. And I will say that there are all kinds of other biases that we face. I mean, it's so routine to submit material to, a journal and, just face a completely different experience. If you have one white person on your manuscript, the reception, the way you're talked to from an editor, everything is just completely different. And just, everyone in India laughs about this, right? Of course, and people think, oh, it's India, must be fake science, right? And, this is not to discount the number of people who have done fake science from this country. I routinely teach about all of the ways in which data falsification and so on take place. But these are particular forms of bias that are very rarely understood or acknowledged in terms of how international funding around science happens. And I just want to state, this makes those international funders have a poverty of applications. You're dealing with less proposals. You're dealing with, you're excluding large majority of scientists around the world who have interesting ideas, who want to implement interesting, research programs. And I think that the way in which minorities are operationalized, continuing to be specific to constituencies within, for lack of a better word, white supremacist states, right? Where the structure of the government continues to function via the logic of white supremacy, I think that's problematic.
Oh, before we move on to the final section, Amir would like to unmute themselves and ask you directly a question, if that's okay. When you are ready, Amir, just ask away.
Do you hear me? Sorry,
Yeah.
sorry, I had raised my hand about the previous discussion about Jose's question. I forgot to put my hand down. But anyway, I think this is a really challenging issue to me, at least, deciding whether I have to open my gender identity when I apply to different positions. I had this bad experience of being kicked out of a group because of just due to my gender identity. But I find it very very awkward and difficult to openly talk about my gender identity when I'm applying for a position. Yeah, I wanted to ask you, how do you think it's proper to do that? And then as a recruiter also, would you inquire the gender identity or being a member of a minority group in general from the applicants? And do you find it proper to prioritize those minority groups? Thank you.
Maybe Camila?
So I can definitely answer the first question, which is, how do you do it and not be, clunky about it? I totally understand that. And I think the way that I've always done it, which is probably like very, British, like wink, is that I talk about the kind of LGBT diversity efforts that I've been involved in. So it's probably in every single job application or funding application I've put in since finishing my PhD or even during my PhD, because you always have to write about sections of kind of contributions to the community or public outreach or whatever. And so that's the context in which I bring it up. And I was actually once told not to. So I was going to a fellowship interview and I was advised not to mention it. And I did feel really like, oh, okay. But then, I thought about it and I just thought, well, if people on the panel genuinely use that as a discriminating characteristic, then probably I'd rather not, So anyway, I did. I've always kept it in, but that's how I do it. I don't actually, I would rarely say, I sometimes might say it in the context of those efforts as an LGBT scientist or whatever, but usually I would just talk about those efforts. And that's like the way of outing myself that I do. Whether it's something I actively ask when I recruit staff members, definitely not. this is something that I think people know about me from the moment they join my lab or even before. And if they ever want to out themselves to me, they are more than welcome to. But I never, ever ask.
In the States, in some states, it's illegal to ask. If you are if the interviewer cannot ask these questions at all, right? So if you are applying for someplace in the US and somebody asks you that, they're committing a crime. Just FYI, they're violating the rules and the laws. So that's all the US context.
Again, I want to offer a perspective that may be quite different from some of the others, in the sense that in India we have two kinds of forms of discrimination. So, for example, caste discrimination, which is quite specific to the South Asian subcontinent. One of at least in India, the writer of the Constitution really envisaged a way to deal with this and created statutory forms of constitutional forms of affirmative action. And these are very, very useful. People can decide whether they want to avail of them or not. Unfortunately, it doesn't apply to a lot of private universities, although they really should. But at least in governmental institutions, these frameworks sort of standardly apply. And so the onus is not on specific professors, right, as to how you assess minority status. The other thing that I typically do is whenever recruiting in any way, I always put out a blurb saying, look, if you're from any marginalized group, this will act as an advantage when you apply to my lab. Feel free to mention it if you'd like, right? And then I don't ask anybody, of course. People who would like to and who think, and also a lot of it is word of mouth, right? So people trust you when you say such a thing. And if people do trust you and they know that you're an ally and they know that you have fought around diversity in STEM, then they will often themselves decide that if they feel safe enough to do this. In terms of stating oneself being part of a minority group, this really varies with where you want to sort of locate yourself. Again, around gender identity, I've never had a choice about outing myself. It's often something that I have to do if I want people to respect my pronouns at all. And often I'm the first trans person they've encountered, and often the first trans masculine person, since trans feminine visibility is more stigmatized, but more visible in this context. So often many of these applications ask for your gender, and I separately specify my gender identity, and I often say trans person, so that I don't want if I say man, right, even if I identify as a trans man, I identify as a genderqueer trans man, but I don't want to then have to field questions about that. So I find it easier again to just put it to say I'm a transgender man, right? And then I'll let people do their Googling or whatever they want to do in order to sort of do their preliminary research to understand what that is. So again, almost all places ask you for your gender, right? They don't expect you to say anything other than they expect cis answers. But if you are openly saying that you're trans, of course, you don't know the doors that are closed because of what you've put out there, but you don't have to worry about them either, because they just never enter your cognitive realm. And that I find is a nicer way of living than not having it there and then having to deal with transphobes once I reach there. Once I reach there, I like saying, you knew I was trans from day one, here's how I expect you to behave. And that I think really, really helps. And remember, the awkwardness around gender identity, comes from a particular system, comes from a system that thinks that, there's something awkward about being trans. And so I like to talk about my transness in the way that other people talk about being cis, people will say I'm a girly girl or a man's man all the time, and I'll say I'm a trans man, right? And then I just, find that, again, for me, it's just cognitive load, easier to handle the world this way for me.
I agree with that, because I, as a queer person myself, have been femme-ish and femme-presenting and obviously gay for many, many years. And it's not like I can go back in the closet. I can try and butch it up, but it just doesn't work in terms of how I express myself. So I'm very open about that. I got advised when I was looking for faculty jobs, like, oh, well, you should wear a suit and do this. I'm like, I don't want to go anywhere where I have to wear a suit every day. I'm going to wear my pink and my glitter and my nail polish. And if they don't like it, then I don't want the job. I'm like, that was my attitude. I'd rather go to some place where I know I'm going to be celebrated, which I ended up being at a place where I'm celebrated. So because I put myself out there, that's not that I'm safe doing that in this context of where I'm at. Not everybody is. So yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your questions. Let's move to the last section that is about the advances in representation and visibility. So comes perfect with the last discussions we just have. I will change the order of the questions because I know Camila may have a hard set time to leave. So maybe she wants to answer, how can LGBTQ plus neuroscientists themselves contribute to increasing their visibility and representation within the field, which is a very related topic?
So I think there isn't one right way to do it. I've certainly seen other LGBTQ plus neuroscientists do it in very different ways. Despite our discussion about the challenges in coming out, and I absolutely agree, you don't have to come out. Actually, that is one of the biggest things you can do. And I have LGBTQ plus friends who do nothing else except be out, and that makes such a big difference. So if you are able to, if you do feel comfortable, it can make a huge difference with the comfort of other people, especially more early career neuroscientists. I also think, it can be quite useful to just sort of get involved in specific diversity efforts, not just for LGBTQ plus people, because actually we often each have various intersectionalities that are equally relevant. And so sort of, I think, diversifying your advocacy efforts can be useful. But I think nevertheless, sort of being as much as you can, as you increase in seniority, being in the room with the awareness of these issues, with the kind of having your colleagues' backs, even when they happen to, even when you might not know who is or isn't suffering from a particular issue, but being aware and able to say, hang on a second, I can foresee a potential problem with that. That's really what I see as the job of LGBT neuroscientists.
That's a very interesting take on it. So now if you are in a rush, feel free to leave if we extend a bit over. Thank you if that will be the case, Camila.
Thanks so much. It was great to be here and lovely to hear from you all.
So can we move on to Soraya? In what ways has representation and visibility of queer neuroscientists improved in recent years? We are always speaking about the positives with you, Soraya. And what impact has this had on you?
Yeah, I think social media has had a huge impact on queer visibility. I don't use it very often, but when I do, I see 500 queer scientists or out at UCL, out in STEM, creating collections of queer people sharing their stories, having repositories if you want someone for a talk. And I think importantly as well, like it's again often focused on the science. It's not necessarily talking about EDI stuff, but it's really promoting queer scientists and their work. Yeah, I guess I've already touched on this. It does bring some conflicts for me personally, because as I mentioned, I'm not out to half of my family, and there's I guess the cognitive load of having to balance wanting to be visible, wanting to be a queer representation in academia, but also knowing that sometimes my family Google me, right? And like I basically told myself that I wouldn't not do anything that I wanted to do because of this, but I don't know if I've actually held true to that, because I don't have a profile on these things, right? And this is why. And so yeah, so I think it's brilliant and amazing, and I guess I'm a little jealous, honestly. But there's like a bit of a personal conflict there. Again, keeping it positive.
No, we don't have to keep it positive. Of course, I think these topics are quite interesting, and how within the same person this conflict can happen, of course. So going on the topic of social media, conferences, professional networks, what role do they play in amplifying the voices and experiences of the community, Troy? What do you think?
Well, I think societies, especially in neuroscience and in fields that impact LGBTQ mental health and trans health access, it is important to have voices from the community there and active. To either, I've participated on several panels over the year at different societies about these issues, that and have written about these issues in publications for a variety of societies. It's really about allowing those voices to be heard and magnifying them as much as possible, so that our cishet allies know what to do, have a better idea of how to say things, to feel comfortable defending us, coming to our aid. That's really important, because we are a minority. I mean, like, there aren't that many of us, and it is the most important thing to have allies. We can't survive without them. And so getting them to understand through work through societies or publications, I think is the best thing that scientists can do right now as queer scientists, is to get our allies together. And I, and along with other people who are involved with ALBA, have been, this organization is doing the same thing. It's about making sure that the voices are heard and people are listening. People in power. For a prime example, American College of Neuropsychopharmacology just made an announcement that they're no longer going to meet in states that have regressive laws for LGBT. They're meeting in Florida this year, and then after that they're changing. And that was because people like me and other queer people have been advocating again for this for a long time, and it came to fruition this year that they changed how they're doing things. I'm doing the same for other societies, trying to get how they're changing things, where they meet. So it's all about, it's about getting those societies and the professional allies on board. And
well, we have only a few minutes left, so I would like to encourage the attendees to ask one or two more questions if we have some time. But finally, is there anything that we haven't discussed today that you would like to bring up, to talk about, for the audience to take away? So it's open to all of you, obviously. If not, I have a question of my own. So, but feel free to add whatever you may think could be interesting.
I just one minor point, really, and I want to acknowledge ALBA and the work that you're doing. I also want to give a clear picture of the progress that's happened. Like I said, I've been out for 30 years, and this never would have happened in the 90s. Like, these conversations were not happening 20 years ago. Like, things are changing. I'm not saying things are better, but we have a voice and we need to use it. Those who can should be using their voice, and things can change from that. They certainly have in the 30 years I've been out.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm gonna ask a question that I have to see your take on this. So, is there any way that neuroscience itself, as a science, can improve the lives of the people from the community? And what's your take on this?
Oh, yes. My field of neuroendocrinology, we study hormones in the brain. And I and a bunch of other people have been pushing, like I said earlier, our field to deal with sex and gender in a way that is inclusive and not pathologizing trans people and gender diverse people. Like, our science is being used to restrict healthcare access in the States right now. And no one's saying anything about it except for trans and gender diverse and queer people, right? It's like, why are you allowing your science to be used in this way, unless you actually don't care? like basically calling people out on it. I mean, this is, and so I'm very passionate about this. So our field also be used to figure out, to help the community. Like, I'm not interested in why people are trans or gay or whatever. I'm interested in how science can help us live a better life that reduces the stress that we experience from living in a homophobic and transphobic society. And I can go on, but I'll let other people talk.
Yeah, I don't want to add up a lot, but I do think that overall, for trans and queer people, but also, as I said, we have a particular historical burden, I think, around disability and mental health to meet. And also, I think if we are to debunk various aspects of assumed cognitive differences across racial categories, gendered categories, and so on, much of that work is going to come from neuroscience and understanding the neural basis of socialization. And so I think that, that we have a lot of these responsibilities, and there's a lot that the field can do to work in these directions.
Well, I'm afraid the time has finished for the webinar of today. I encourage you all to participate in the in this week, in the next activities. Thank you all the panelists for your amazing responses. Thank you all the attendees for your great questions. And yep, please, just a reminder, if you would like to reply the questions in the survey, that will be really useful for Alba. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having us. It was a really great chat.
It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much for organizing. Take care, everybody.